It's my pleasure to welcome you all to this fourth and final high-level dialogue, the title of which is Accelerating Financing for Risk Prevention. I'd also like to extend a warm welcome to everybody joining us online from around the world. This year's global platform is particularly important as it'll provide input to the midterm review of the Sendai framework, which will hopefully guide efforts to accelerate action over the remaining 7 years. Investing in disaster risk reduction for resilience is, of course, one of the 4 priorities of the Sendai framework. As we know, societies continue to bear the increasing costs of Well, I think the technical gremlins are going to be with us today, so again, it might be a result of the rain yesterday. So yeah, we appreciate your patience. I was just saying that although investing in prevention makes good financial sense, there is, of course, a chronic underinvestment. In certain countries, domestic public finances earmarked for risk prevention as a primary objective are on average less than 1% of the budget. At present, much of the policy, regulation and accounting practices do not mandate consideration or disclosure of the financial impacts of disasters. Even though this trend may be changing slowly, measures so far are limited to climate risks. Now, in this era of COVID-19, development finance does recognize the value of investing in ex-ante disaster risk reduction to bridge the short term with the long term, whilst addressing climate change and ensuring overall sustainability. But, and it is a big but, such an investment requires a fundamental shift in mindset across both the public sector as well as investment and financial sectors. The bottom line is that long-term thinking, considering current and future risks, is required to achieve risk-informed, sustainable development pathways. Now, the aim of this high-level dialogue is to identify options for enhancing financing for prevention. We'll consider the need to promote a think resilience approach. That becomes mandatory in all public as well as private sector investments. To give you context, let's begin with an introductory video.
The COVID-19 pandemic has highlighted the global need for investing in prevention and resilience, and has provided us with a unique opportunity to rethink investment in sustainable development so that it reduces rather than creates risk. Societies have more data about risk than ever before, so we know that the occurrence of disasters is a matter of when and not if. Yet in several countries, less than 1% of national budgets are allocated to risk reduction. Disaster risk reduction and resilience are not prioritized because they are wrongly perceived as a cost for an event that might not happen. The public sector should not be the only one to account for disaster risk prevention. Private sector investments are equally at risk. Capital markets that fail to account for disaster risk are essentially bankrolling future catastrophes. The value of global financial assets at risk from climate change has been estimated at $4.2 trillion by The Economist. Between 2005 and 2017, $137 billion was provided in development assistance related to disasters, but less than 4% went into disaster prevention or preparedness. We need to build a new social contract for investing in disaster resilience. A think resilience approach should be mandatory for all public and private sector investments. To change investor behavior, national regulators need to define sustainable, disaster-resilient investments. All investment decisions need to commit to net resilience gain. Interventions must demonstrate that they enhance the systemic resilience of infrastructure without causing external damages. Mandatory disclosure of disaster risks should be part of statutory reporting. The insurance sector should ensure disaster risk assessment as a precondition for premium setting. Innovative models, such as impact investing, can contribute toward implementation of the Sendai framework. Bonds linked to climate resilience will also help to leverage finance for more disaster prevention actions. COVID-19 has provided the world with an opportunity to reframe investment in disaster risk reduction. We need to seize it now.
There we have it. Think resilience. Before we go any further, please allow me to outline a few matters through this particular session. If you are watching online and you wish to follow us in one of the 6 UN languages, you can select the language channel in the box to the right of the video window. It's very important that you mute the audio from the video player, otherwise you'll hear the original language plus the interpretation. There is a short video on the reception page that explains how to do this. For comments and questions to our panel members, please use the Slido application. We will have, of course, a Q&A towards the end of this session. In-room participants can connect on slido.com using their mobile phones and insert the code that's shown on the room screen. For those following us online in Hopin, please access the tab Q&A on the right-hand side menu. If you are in the room and are unable to use Slido, please raise your hand, and in the good old-fashioned way, an in-room support staff will come to assist you. If you are in Hopin and are unable to use the Q&A or any other Hopin feature, please contact the online support team via the chat box. And now it gives me great pleasure to introduce our first keynote speaker, who's just arrived, Her Excellency W.K. Mutalia Nalumango, Vice President of Zambia.
Your Excellency, Mr. Dressmans, Ambassador, European Delegation to Asia. Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, it is my honor and privilege to give a keynote speech at this high-level dialogue dubbed Accelerating Financing for Risk Prevention. Allow me from the onset to underscore the costly nature of disasters. Disasters have generated a broad range of direct and indirect impacts on all parts of society, including loss of life, displacement of people from their traditional habitations, and damage to property and infrastructure. In addition, disasters have imposed fiscal constraints arising from humanitarian assistance, recovery, and reconstruction expenditures. Further, disasters disrupt economic activities, consequently reducing the opportunity and capacity of the state to extract tax revenue. Indeed, when disasters occur, they choke the creation of wealth and then divert the remaining resources away from developmental programs. However, the impact of disasters from a socio-economic perspective can be minimized if adequate attention and resources are directed towards pre-disaster activities centered around comprehensive preparedness. In practice, this would involve accurate identification of hazards and risks, predetermination of the potential impact, and then mounting prevention and mitigation measures. Moreover, climate change has imposed a complex dynamic which has resulted in increased intensity, frequency, and unpredictability of disasters. With the prevailing financing paradigm, this has translated into more resources being spent on activities during and post-disaster occurrence. There is evidence that over the past 4 decades, economic losses resulting from disasters more than doubled, increasing from 1,313 million United States dollars between 1978 and 1997 to 2,908 million United States dollars between 1998 and 2017. Moreover, the proportion of climate disasters out of total economic value of disasters has also increased in the same period, from 68% to 77% of the total. Note also that reported losses from extreme weather events rose by 151% between these two 20-year periods. Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, the prevailing disaster financing paradigm suffers from a structural distributional weakness. Disproportionately, more resources are directed towards emergency response, restructuring, relief, and rehabilitation when compared with prevention and resilience. Evidence suggests that between 2005 and 2017, for resources from development assistance, about 96% of funds were spent on the emergency response, reconstruction, relief, and rehabilitation, leaving only about 4% for prevention, mitigation, and preparedness. In general, there is gross underinvestment in disaster risk reduction activities, yet optimum use of resources for sustainable development would result from investment in risk prevention rather than post-disaster activities such as emergency response, reconstruction, relief, and rehabilitation. The pattern of expenditure for disasters matters. Hence, it is not just about making funds available for disasters. It is also about efficiency and effectively mobilizing and utilizing funds by transforming the financing paradigm right from the configuration and allocation of expenditure. Indeed, current financing practices remain unsatisfactory in shifting the financing paradigm. For example, in a quest to increase financing for disaster preparedness and response, the African Union and Southern African Development Community, SADC, have come up with initiatives such as the African Risk Capacity ARC and the Southern African Development Community Disaster Preparedness Strategy and Fund. However, these efforts are aimed at mobilizing resources primarily for response as opposed to disaster risk reduction. Zambia and other countries will this year benefit from the payout for drought from the African Risk Capacity, but this presents a post-disaster expenditure. Countries such as my own have increased funding for disaster-related activities from their national budgets. What is yet to be seen is whether resource utilization will reflect a paradigm shift in favor of investment in risk prevention. Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, shifting the financing paradigm is not an easy task. It will depend on a number of initial conditions, including A, the relative advancement of the existing disaster risk reduction initiatives in a given country. B, the political will of the implementing country at the highest level of leadership. C, a country's capacity to mobilize resources. D, the innovativeness of the configuration of related financing towards risk reduction initiatives. And E, the availability and access to credible information informing the scale and potential disaster loss. Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, in conclusion, let me highlight some critical points worth reflecting upon. It is important that this high-level dialogue, A, recognizes the need to account for the full cost of disasters and climate impacts. B, recognizes the existence of alternative innovative financing arrangements for disaster-related activities. And C, highlights existing opportunities and practical approaches for governments, policymakers, and private sector to set up commitments and take decisive action to strengthen resilience and adaptive capacities of local communities. Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, this dialogue will therefore provide us with an opportunity to share experiences and showcase opportunities for enhancing financing for disaster risk reduction activities. I call for an open dialogue and free participation. Remember to take home the importance of financing for disaster risk reduction. I thank you.
And indeed, I thank Her Excellency Mutale Nalumango, Vice President of Zambia, for her speech. Despite the technical hurdles, I hope you appreciate that we've been resilient here and managed to get the message across. I now have the pleasure to invite Ms. Armida Ali Shabana, Executive Secretary of the United Nations Economic and Social Commission for Asia and Pacific, ESCAP, as many of us know it, for her keynote remarks.
Thank you, Russell. Excellency Madam Mutale Nalumango, Vice President of Zambia, Excellencies, distinguished participants, ladies and gentlemen, greetings from Bangkok, Thailand. It is my pleasure to join you today at the high-level dialogue on accelerating financing for risk prevention. I think we all agree that we live in a richer but riskier world. No one knows what extreme event will be next, and we need to make significant efforts to anticipate what lies ahead. Within the framework of the Secretary General's report, Our Common Agenda at the global level, ESCAP's Common Agenda and its associated ministerial declaration is a renewed common resolve among ESCAP's members and associate members to jointly address and adapt to the increasing vulnerability to shocks, including climate change and climate-induced disaster. We expect the ministerial declaration will be adopted today, this afternoon, at the conclusion or closing of our commission session. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, with climate change worsening the impacts of disasters on peoples and economies, raising financial resources to reduce disaster risk must be a common priority for the Asia-Pacific region. Drawing from the findings of our flagship report, Asia-Pacific Disaster Report of last year, may I share key messages. First, under the worst-case climate change scenario, annual economic losses could rise to about $1.3 trillion or about 4.2% of the region's GDP. Second, annual adaptation costs under the same worst-case climate scenario could amount to about $270 billion, or equivalent to 0.85% of regional GDP, which is significantly less than the estimated annual economic losses of 4.2% of regional GDP. Third, the increasing climate-related disasters will have multiple impacts on the economic health of countries and their most vulnerable population. For example, damage to assets will trigger the need for large post-disaster public finance investment that will increase government's fiscal risk due to higher contingent liabilities. Food prices are expected to continue to rise as extreme weather events damage crops and reduce agriculture productivity, impacting health and nutrition of people. Additionally, a decrease in productivity due to the uncertainty about future losses will lead to high precautionary savings and a potential loss of livelihoods. To lessen these impacts, allow me to suggest a few innovative financial solutions. The first one is investing in key adaptation measures such as early warning system, water resource management, infrastructure resilience, and nature-based solutions that improve dryland agriculture crop production will provide the highest cost-benefit ratio. Here, I'm pleased to inform you that our Risk and Resilience Portal is an innovative web-based platform that can support sectoral prioritization of financing for climate adaptation. The second one is that while donors, governments, and multilateral development banks have gradually scaled up financial assistance for disaster risk reduction and climate adaptation, additional funding is needed. Increasingly, countries are raising funds through thematic bonds that include catastrophe bonds. Likewise, it is important to link NDC, or nationally determined contribution, to financing mechanisms such as debt for climate swap. Third, innovations in catastrophe risk modeling and the creation of parametric insurance instruments for risk transfer present further example of the expanding and promising array of risk financing instruments available. And last, there is scope to strengthen regional cooperation. And in this regard, the proposal for a new ASEAN +3 initiative on disaster risk financing that builds on the existing regional initiatives such as the ASEAN Disaster Risk Financing and Insurance and the Southeast Asia Disaster Insurance Facility is a step in the right direction. Financing adaptation and resilience pathway is key to being prepared for what lies ahead. Towards the end, we look forward to working closely in partnership with UNDRR as well as all stakeholders. Thank you very much.
Our thanks to Ms. Armida Al-Sabana for her remarks. Thank you very much indeed. Yes, and as she reiterated, they're investing in early warning systems, transport systems, water management, of course, absolutely vital, and again underlying the need, always room to strengthen regional cooperation. Let's move on now to our panelists, who are, to my left, His Excellency Mr. Ramon Soto Bonilla, Secretary of State Disaster Risk Management from Honduras. Bienvenido. Mr. Kamal Kishore, who's Member Secretary, NDMA, the Government of India. And to my right, I have Ambassador Igor Driesmans of the EU delegation to ASEAN, and Mr. Graham Clark, who is CEO of Asian Affinity Holdings. Welcome, all of you. Before I turn to them, let me remind you once again that we also want to hear from you on this important topic. So in-room participants can connect on slido.com using their mobile phones and, of course, insert the code that is shown on the room screen. For those following us online in Hopin, please access the tab Polls and Q&A on the right-hand side menu. And if you could indicate your name, organization, and country when doing so. Let's turn to the panelists. I think we all agree that financing prevention is critical if we want to achieve the targets of the Sendai framework and the SDG goals. Before I raise specific questions, I'd like to put forward a broad question to all of the panel. We've heard a lot during this global platform. We've a lot of concern about the time frame associated with Sendai. Are we on track to achieve the Sendai targets for DRR? And how do you see the challenge of financing prevention and investing in disaster resilience going beyond risk insurance? Let me start with His Excellency, Mr. Soto Bonilla.
Muy buenos días, compañeros panelistas, copresidentes de la mesa, excelencias, bienvenidos. En realidad, hemos caído, y especialmente en los países en desarrollo, en un círculo vicioso de respuesta a desastre, recuperación, respuesta a desastre, recuperación, generando una inversión, sí, pero que al final no ofrece resiliencia, porque nos hemos dedicado a responder, a enfocarnos en la respuesta y no en la preparación. Y esto ha hecho que el presupuesto de los países cada vez se vea más afectado. Y los grupos más marginados son los que soportan de manera desproporcionada el impacto de los desastres debido a las condiciones de vulnerabilidad en que vive. Es obvio. Pero al mismo tiempo también existen oportunidades en el financiamiento del riesgo y en la prevención. Por ejemplo, una mayor inclusión y acceso a fondos a nivel local y comunitario. A veces se tiende a planificar desde el nivel central del gobierno, sin llegar a las comunidades, especialmente a los municipios. Quienes mejor conocen la temática y la problemática de la vulnerabilidad de sus municipios son precisamente los alcaldes. Hemos trabajado en Honduras desde el año 2000, después del MICH, precisamente en una caracterización del territorio nacional que ya lo tenemos en gran medida, tomando para ello como base los municipios. El municipio con una estructura que se llama CODEM, Comité de Emergencia Municipal. Eso nos está permitiendo generar una mejor respuesta, realizar una mejor preparación, lograr una mayor resiliencia y que los fondos sean mejor invertidos con mayor conocimiento por parte de las autoridades locales. Pero ¿qué retos impiden a veces la inversión en prevención de riesgos? Bueno, el incremento de los costos en el presupuesto general de la República, especialmente en mi país, Honduras, con una economía bastante frágil, que ha sido muy golpeado por diferentes fenómenos. Si no es en un periodo del año es la sequía, y luego viene una cantidad desproporcionada de agua, de precipitaciones, entonces nos vuelve vulnerables a las inundaciones. Y ya por ahí hemos tenido un que otro terremoto también. Somos un país multi-amenazas y eso genera que cada año tengamos un presupuesto deficitario. Entonces, al incorporar las obras de mitigación, tanto en el mantenimiento de las que ya están, como en la construcción de nuevas obras de mitigación, eso hace que el presupuesto sea a veces inalcanzable. Pero repito, estamos trabajando en buenas prácticas. Tenemos una nueva ley de SINAGER, que es el Sistema Nacional de Gestión de Riesgo, en el cual están incluidos una serie de agencias, tanto gubernamentales como privadas, que tienen que ver en la gestión del riesgo y que hemos hecho una ley a la medida de nuestro país, con la inclusión de género, especialmente con la inclusión de género. Y hemos incluido también los diferentes sectores étnicos. Honduras es un país multiétnico. También hemos puesto especial atención en el abuso infantil, porque dentro de los albergues, cuando nos toca evacuar personas, porque llega el momento de la respuesta, se presentan problemas de abuso infantil, se han presentado problemas de abuso infantil, violencia de género e incluso abuso a la fémina. Todo esto ya lo hemos legislado y lo hemos hecho fuertemente. Tenemos mucho camino que recorrer a nivel mundial, mucho camino que recorrer. Acá nosotros pedimos acompañamiento y sobre todo en la meta número 6 de las metas Sendai, que es el apoyo a los países en desarrollo, a los pequeños países en desarrollo. Pedimos que, esa era una meta del 2021, que aún todavía tenemos materia pendiente. Y obviamente para el 2022, la meta número 7, que es la implementación de los programas de alerta temprana. Esa es parte integral de la resiliencia y de la respuesta correcta ante los fenómenos. Muchas gracias por nuestra parte.
Señor Bonilla, muchas gracias. Volvemos a la respuesta más tarde. If I can turn to Kamal now. Kamal, same question for you, please.
So, Russell, let me quickly... Okay, this is back up. Quickly first address, reflect a little bit on how you're doing on Sendai targets, and then I'll come to financing prevention. I think on the Sendai targets, the answer is not binary. It's not that we are on track or off track. I think the picture is mixed. There are some targets, if we consider that COVID-19 was a 1 in 100-year disaster, a bit of an outlier, quite a bit of an outlier, we must recognize the progress that is being made in reducing mortality, improving the prevalence of, improving the access to early warning systems, strategies and plans at the local level. So at least 4 out of 7 targets. I think we have made tremendous progress. I mean, I'm not just talking about India, but across the world. It is really important that we don't beat ourselves too much and celebrate the successes we've had in the last 7-8 years. If you look at access to early warning for hydromet hazards, I mean, humanity has never had the kind of access to early warning that we have now. In India, we have heat wave forecasts that are actionable, understandable, usable, which was not the case 6 years ago. Cyclone, 100% coverage. Plans and strategies at the local level, 100% coverage across the country. So I think it is really important that we recognize that. Of course, we can't be complacent. There's a long way to go. Now, coming to the issue of financing itself. There are 2 principal challenges here. One is that we, of course, want to mainstream disaster risk financing in all development work. But at the same time, we need to ring-fence some resources which can have a catalytic impact on the rest of the financing. So for India, I can say that we are putting our money where our mouth is. For the first time in the country's history, we have 20% of total disaster risk financing resources exclusively for disaster risk reduction. And that's a significant amount of money, $5 billion spread over 5 years. This is in addition to money for preparedness and response. This is in addition to money for recovery and reconstruction. This is in addition to money for response, so exclusively for risk reduction. But is that $5 billion enough? Of course not. I think we have to make sure that we use this $5 billion to leverage resources within sectors, within water resources, within education, within health, within infrastructure, to make sure that all of that development financing is risk-informed. So it has to have a catalytic impact. So I think that's one issue. The other is, how do we mobilize private investment into financing prevention? I think that's where I think there is a long way to go. But in terms of gearing the public finance system towards risk reduction. I think we've come a long way. We've traveled a long distance in the last 7 years. I think it's important that we recognize these successes and build on these. Thank you.
Thank you, Kamal. And I think it is important, as you were saying there, to reflect that it's not all downbeat all the time. And we need to celebrate some of the successes, obviously, that we've achieved during the past 7 years. As many of you might have noticed, Her Excellency Mutale Nalomango, the Vice President of Zambia, has had to leave us. But we are now joined by Dr. Gabriel Pollen, who is National Coordinator, Disaster Management and Mitigation Unit, Office of Vice President of the Government of Zambia. And if I could turn to you for this general question that we're asking all our panelists, and it is about how do you see the challenges of financing prevention going beyond risk insurance?
Thank you very much for that question, and I think I'll try and address that from the experiences of Zambia in particular and some of the unique challenges that we face around disaster risk reduction financing. So the first thing that you would understand is that questions around disaster risk reduction should not be seen from a kind of homogeneous perspective, because countries have different levels of development and therefore are exposed as well to different types of hazards and risk. So from the sort of Zambian perspective, we would look at the challenge of financing from a sort of resource-constrained economy that's emerging from a very high debt, for example. And then you look at the political contradictions and the willingness to understand and embed disaster risk reduction within the national development plans. So the good part about the way in which things are unraveling in Zambia at the moment is that we have the 8th National Development Plan. That is the first national development plan to mainstream disaster risk reduction and to allocate resources towards disasters in general. But one of the key problems or challenges that we're facing is the lack of regional and international coordination around disaster risk reduction and how the international community comes into play in financing the tail end of disaster management in general. So from the perspective of the financing component of disaster management in general, if you look at the entire continuum, a more localized climate risk and vulnerability data availability would inform the way in which countries respond to disasters in general and allocate resources more towards risk reduction. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Pollen. Obviously, we'll move down the line, I think, for further responses. So, Ambassador Driesmans, from the EU delegation to ASEAN, if you could offer your remarks, please.
Thank you for having me, and thank you for inviting the European Union to this very distinguished panel. I would agree with Mr. Kamal that there's been really good progress made by different stakeholders in different regions. Yet, I think the short answer is we are not yet on track with some of the targets or some of their indicators of the Sendai framework. I'm thinking in particular of the reduction of damage to critical infrastructure, or the number of countries that have a multi-hazard early warning system. I think basically the climate crisis has accelerated to such an extent that disaster and climate impacts simply outpace the progress that has been made. Now, one challenge is a lack of data and the measurability of the indicators, sometimes coupled with a lack of clear responsibilities or indeed the weak political will. Then there is the finance. There are huge challenges linked to predictable, sustainable, and sufficient financing for all components of disaster risk management. Now, it is vital to generate and promote greater evidence on the returns of investments in resilient practices and technologies under the umbrella of disaster risk reduction, climate change, adaptation, and anticipatory action to facilitate this kind of risk-informed decision-making and investment choices. Secondly, it's important to expand public public-private partnership to enhance this access to resources, including innovations, tools, expertise, and funding, notably in settings where market-based solutions are not sufficiently attractive. That would be my 2 cents as an introduction.
Thank you, Ambassador Driesmans. If I can now turn to the final member of the panel, and that is Mr. Graham Clark, CEO, Asian Affinity Holdings, probably the only representative of the private sector that we have on this panel. I hope we don't feel too outnumbered. Your remarks, please.
Thank you, Rob. Your Excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, firstly, thank you for inviting us to participate, to UNDRR, to participate in this panel. Just to provide a little bit of perspective, our focus as a group and what we do is probably the most challenging area of financial services in the sense of how do we deliver liquidity and protection to the base of the pyramid, last mile, grassroots communities. So I'd like to kind of position this a little bit from the point of view of what's the community thinking, where are we on the journey. For Sendai, 2 to 3 points. I think that we've come a long way and there's been some extraordinary impactful and good work. Engagement, particularly across public-private sector, has been strong and is growing, but more needs to be done, particularly to include civil society within the dialogue. I think we've come through a period of 2 years when most national governments have had their hands absolutely full dealing with the priorities of COVID on a national level. In terms of DRR impact, that's meant for many countries, they've lost the driver for the community impact of what's been done for DRR. So I think that although that in itself highlights the risk, that if we leave it purely for governments and purely at the macro level in terms of delivering DRR, then it's a risk in itself. We need to be more holistic. I think that this is a particularly important thing post-COVID, whereas we're looking at now, governments have their hands full for this next 18 months, building and enhancing health infrastructure, building out ICU capacity. This is global, this is every country has this issue. So over that period of the next year, how do we get the feedback from the grassroots community? How have they suffered? You have a perfect example here in Bali to see what the impact of COVID has been on the hospitality business and on rural communities. It's extreme. So there are lessons in there for all of us, but my plea would be, please try and make it more inclusive as we start to grow. Moving beyond risk, just 2 quick points. I think there have been some extraordinary changes that are taking place. Number one, within the insurance industry, we are much more inclusive. Finally, we're moving out of our silos. So if you look at the national and the global initiatives, the Insurance Development Forum, which is a grouping of non-profits, multilaterals, insurance community, broad and holistic, all focusing on the base of the pyramid. It's done some extraordinary work and is just getting into its stride. We have the cooperative movement, ICMIF, which is the partnering with UNDRR, a key element of the insurance industry because they engage with communities. They are cooperative. So therefore, in terms of feedback is important. And then one area where we have heard very little this week, Blue Impact. Organizations such as AURA, which is the Ocean Risk and Action Resilience Alliance, that is predominantly an insurance initiative for Blue Impact, for coastal community, how to build that resilience. Perhaps the most hopeful development came from COP26. GFANZ and the extraordinary initiative that Mark Carney is leading has earmarked, I use the word generally, 130 trillion of potential assets for investment in climate. That's not all committed. It is the direction in which we're heading, but there is some commitment already from it. That opens a phenomenal opportunity, I think, for the whole DRR financing. If we can weave climate and make that as a priority in the whole question of DRR financing, we have a whole new area of opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you, Graham, and thank you all for your response to that general question. I'd like to turn now, of course, to each of you individually with a specific set of questions. Y empezamos con Señor Bonilla. After Hurricane Eta, which struck in November 2020, where do you see the opportunities to invest in resilience in the reconstruction after disasters, given your experience in Honduras in the resilient reconstruction process?
Gracias. Las lecciones aprendidas que nos deja la experiencia de los huracanes Eta e Iota y otros huracanes y tormentas que han pasado por Honduras nos dicen que las oportunidades, y no solo las oportunidades, sino las necesidades de inversión están justamente en los valles más productivos de Honduras. Uno de ellos es el Valle de Sula, el Valle de Laguán, al igual que zonas también vulnerables como Tegucigalpa, que es la capital y que tiene mucho problema tanto por inundaciones como por deslizamientos y deslaves. Porque Tegucigalpa es una capital que fue construida en un pueblo minero, que no estaba diseñada para ser capital, pero bueno, ahí estamos viviendo. Difícilmente vamos a poder evacuar toda una población y construir otra capital, entonces lo que nos toca es construir potentes obras de mitigación. Y repito, en el Valle de Sula tenemos que hacerlo, porque es el pulmón productivo, es la zona industrial, agrícola, donde se genera la mayor parte del Producto Interno Bruto del país. Por lo tanto, no solo hay que construir nuevas obras, sino también darle mantenimiento y reconstruir las que ya tenemos. Pero claro, y quiero ser aquí enfático, se dificulta muchas veces por una serie de factores, y voy a poner un ejemplo clave. Después de Eta y Iota hubo un incendio en una isla, en un cayo de una de las islas de la bahía en Honduras, en Guanaja. Aún no hemos podido reconstruir la zona del desastre. Se incrementan los costos. Mire, teníamos un fondo para construir 35 viviendas, pero por ser una isla se incrementan los costos de transporte, de construcción, de mano de obra, de materiales, y con lo que podíamos construir 35 viviendas, al incrementarse esos costos solo podemos construir 15 viviendas. Entonces, todas estas experiencias tenemos que buscar cómo convertirlas en oportunidades. Quiero dejar claro, necesitamos obras de mitigación fuertes en los valles más productivos de Honduras que nos ayuden a tener un mayor aumento a la resiliencia y que los costos y las pérdidas en el momento que se presenta el evento destructivo sean menores. Y eso ya lo hemos dicho hasta la saciedad, y no es una frase hecha, es un dato que se viene acumulando, es un dato que lo damos a través de la experiencia acumulada, que por cada dólar en preparación se ahorran $9 en respuesta. Necesitamos en Honduras dar una respuesta con obras de mitigación, aumentar la resiliencia para evitar enormes pérdidas. Construir los bordos del Valle de Sula cuestan entre 600 y 800 millones de lempiras, pero durante Eta e Iota las pérdidas fueron de 1.000 millones de lempiras y medio millón de empleos se perdieron. Espero haber respondido medianamente su pregunta.
Gracias. Sin duda no hay respuestas fáciles, son muy complejas, pero gracias por ahora. Kamal, let me throw some statistics at you, if I may. Based on IMF projections for 2020, India is the fastest growing economy and the fastest growing $1 trillion economy in the world, which means, of course, that there are immense investments from both the public and private sectors. So while these investments would create jobs, they may also create new risks. So how do we go about ensuring that capital market investments account and internalize risks and avoid the creation, of course, of new ones?
Thank you very much, Russell. Indeed, India is the fastest growing trillion-dollar economy, and we have an unprecedented opportunity to bring prosperity and unprecedented human development to billions of people in our country. And of course, it comes with risks, which we need to anticipate and manage. So in response to your question, I'll divide that in two parts. The first part relates squarely to infrastructure development and making infrastructure resilient. Countries like India are investing unprecedented sums of money in building infrastructure. Infrastructure is central to providing good life to people, access to market, creating jobs, access to basic services, services that many people have not had for decades. So it's really important that we invest in infrastructure. But investing in infrastructure in a time of huge uncertainty, particularly given the emerging impacts of climate change, is really something that we have to confront. How do we move beyond managing risks to managing uncertainties? And given this felt need, Government of India with other partners, 30 other countries and 8 international organizations, started the Coalition for Disaster Resilient Infrastructure, presently co-chaired by Government of India and the Government of the United States. To get the infrastructure story right, we need 3 things. Access to good analytics, which looks at not just the present risk, but also the future risk. The coalition is working on a global report which will present the state of the world's infrastructure from a resilience perspective, and it will be launched in the margins of G20 summit next year when India has the presidency of it. So that's one thing. How do we have common and most advanced risk metrics, analytics to inform infrastructure investment? Once you have that, you can use that for prioritizing investments, looking at integrated planning of infrastructure. Already, India has an integrated national infrastructure pipeline, not with the infrastructure ministries, but the Ministry of Finance. Look at it in an integrated way rather than in a disjointed way. The second thing in infrastructure story is upgrading our standards, regulations, including regulating the professions that are involved in building infrastructure. Our standards have to be built, have to cater to risks of tomorrow. Past is no longer a good guide for the future. We have to build for the future, not for the risks we've known in the past. And the third is really how do we structure finance in a manner, both private and public finance, that it nudges us towards resilience. So I think that's one big bucket of things which relates to getting the infrastructure story right. We have the opportunity to get infrastructure right and lock in resilience for decades and perhaps a century out in the future, or lock in risk. I think clearly, the choice has been made. We have to work towards resilience. The second story is really building local capacity. There is no substitute to having capacity at the community level, at the city level, at the municipality level, at the district level. So financing architecture, disaster risk management financing architecture in India currently is really devolving itself to the local level. The more resources we put there, of course, resources are not enough. They need to be complemented with capacities and mechanisms as well. But you can't say that till we have capacities and mechanisms, we will not put the money there. Both have to be pursued together. We have to put our money where our mouth is. I'll say that again. So we've been talking about community-based, we've been talking about local level risk management, but where is the money? Now there is money at the local level. Thank you.
Thank you, Kamal. 3 major points: access to good analytics, upgrade standards, and of course, structuring finance. Thank you, Kamal. Well, there we go. We've had a perspective from Central America and South Asia. Let's turn now to Africa and Dr. Pollen. what are the unique challenges facing the government of Zambia in embedding risk prevention, climate adaptation in public and private investments, and how can these be addressed?
Thank you very much. I think in sort of addressing that question, we have to kind of preface it with an understanding of the policy portfolio within the context of Zambia and how that speaks to issues around disaster risk reduction and climate adaptability. So the first thing that I want to point out is that in Zambia, we do have obviously policies around climate adaptation and prevention. We do have the 8th National Development Plan that mainstreams issues of disaster management, and then we have the National Climate Change Policy of 2016 and the Disaster Risk Management Framework that has kind of set up a policy portfolio within which we expect this conversation and capital accumulation to take place within the context of disaster management. Now, just moving on to very specific, unique challenges that would face Zambia, would probably first have to understand the macro level type contradictions that the country is faced with. So the first thing that we point out is obviously coming from a developing country perspective that has very high public debt and is around whether there is adequate capacity to mobilize resources that can then be used to invest in disaster risk reduction initiative and interventions. Then outside of domestic resource mobilization, you also want to look at whether there is adequate data that can drive a comprehensive data-driven agenda towards disaster risk reduction, and within that context, and whether we do have a kind of financial rationale for investment. In other words, do we have data that would inform investment decisions, both from the public and private sector, that there is a benefit in investments in disaster risk reduction as opposed to response-related activities which are centered around post-disaster activities. Outside of the sort of economic type contradictions, we also have the issues of lifestyle, where you have to convince the local communities that where they situate themselves in terms of habitations matters for how resources will be used, whether it to be a post-disaster case or whether that comes down to the pre-disaster scenario. Now, the way in which you want to map yourself out as a country, I think that's plagued by lack of adequate domestic resource capacity opportunity and a macro level that limits the way in which you conduct yourself in mobilizing these resources. Number one, to try and integrate your development planning with the international community and localize that. So I do agree that there's need also for capacity building to ensure that there's a complete understanding for what the disaster risks are and what the benefits would then result from investments in interventions and initiatives that put a disaster risk reduction, that place a premium on disaster risk reduction. And then there is also, in essence, a need to raise awareness with the private sector. And this then comes down to issues of implementation of your development policy and also policies around investments in general. And I think I'll close by saying that there is an urgent need, again, to integrate disaster risk reduction, particularly from the implementation perspective, whilst also raising capacity for localizing some of the insights that we get from there. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Paul. And of course, convincing local communities to engage, it is, of course, a fundamental problem that we face in all regions. But for now, Dr. Pollen, thank you very much. Let me turn to Ambassador Dreamans. The EU, of course, is one of the key partners assisting countries to achieve the Sendai framework and SDGs. Yet for every $100 spent on total development aid between 2010 and 2018, an 8-year period, disaster risk reduction received as little as 47%, which is less, of course, than half the total. So how is the EU addressing this critical challenge? Where do you see the opportunities to scale up action on financing risk prevention?
Thank you, and thank you for acknowledging that the EU is one of the biggest development providers around the world. I'd start by saying that with the growing needs around the world, the EU support for disaster risk reduction has been growing over the years. Looking back, 2014, in our development budget, we spent 10 million euro. In 2020, that was 845 million euro. You have to add to that what we do in terms of humanitarian assistance, which was some 76 million annually, and you do get close to 1 billion a year. But let me maybe give some examples of what initiatives that we support. First is the Global Climate Change Alliance Plus, which helps the world's most vulnerable countries to address climate change and related hazards. In support of African, Caribbean, and Pacific partners, we have different programs to support regional climate forecasting, to disaster risk governance, mainstreaming risk financing, preparedness, and effective response and recovery. Another example is closer to Indonesia. We support the AHA Center, the ASEAN Center, Coordination Center for Humanitarian Assistance on Disaster Management. And we help them build their capacity to reduce disaster losses in the ASEAN member states and to respond to disaster emergencies. But this doesn't give the full picture. We work as a team Europe with our member states, and many of them are represented here in this room tonight, and together we are one of the biggest climate finance providers. In 2020 alone, this support amounted to more than 23 billion. And maybe one side remark, is that with the vast majority of disasters being triggered by climate-related hazards, climate change adaptation efforts are an important part of our cooperation on disaster risk reduction and prevention. So a significant portion of our climate finance has thus been benefiting disaster risk reduction too. So this is what we currently do. Maybe a word on the future. For the upcoming period leading us to 2027, around 28 billion of the EU budget will be allocated to climate action. We basically set ourselves a spending target of 30% in our Global Europe instrument, which is up from 20% during the previous budget cycle. And we aim to maintain our kind of historical trend of keeping adaptation and mitigation flows in balance. One initiative I'd mention here is basically our Global Gateway initiative, a new framework for international partnership and investments, which aims to scale up our commitments and mobilize 300 billion of quality investment by 2027. Again, maybe some examples of what this would mean for Africa, for example. We announced the Africa EU Science, Technology and Innovation Initiative, which will support Earth observation and leverage EU space programs for climate services and disaster risk reduction. The EU-Africa initiative to boost adaptation and disaster risk reduction, which will enhance disaster preparedness, strengthen governance to manage disaster risks, and so on. Now, we'll be able to present more details of some of these initiatives at COP27. Let's not forget that last year, Executive Vice President Timmermans at COP26 announced a contribution of 100 million euro to the Adaptation Fund. Now, with these investments, we're also providing an important pillar for anticipatory action. That is to say, the necessary infrastructure, access to data, and long-term partnerships. We're applying the human development peace triple nexus approach for anticipatory and sustainable investment in disaster resilience. A last point, because I see my counter is down to zero, on mobilizing financing. We're engaging developing countries to address barriers and constraints for accessing adaptation and risk reduction finance. So countries need to be able to mobilize funding without routinely relying on external assistance, and we've been supporting initiatives such as the local climate adaptive living facility or the global green bonds initiative with this objective in mind. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Driesmans, and we look forward to hearing these announcements at COP27. Let us turn now to our private sector representative, Mr. Clark. How do we get the insurance market to invest in risk prevention? There must be some bottlenecks, so what are they?
Thank you, Russell. Yes, I'm going to flip those questions on their heads and see if we can pick up a couple of bottlenecks first and see what we can do about that. Then I'd like to put up a couple of new ideas. When we talk about the insurance industry, it's not one amorphous mass. There are three distinct sectors. There are the primary, what we would call general insurers, the non-life companies. They are the primary acceptor of risk. Behind them sit the reinsurers. The more critical one for DRR are the life insurers. The life insurers provide not only the indemnity for life, for insurance, but also are a major source of capital investment. If we look at the G7 economies, the G7 countries, the life insurers there play an absolutely critical role in funding government infrastructure and buying bonds. Life insurers need to match their long-term liabilities to their assets. So being able to get into infrastructure and bonds suits their balance sheets. Now, in the non-G7 countries, that's a lot more difficult to do because the strengthening of it needs considerable strengthening of the life sector to be able to create that kind of capital base. But this in a time, particularly like now, when post-COVID government funding is tight, and being able to go to the private sector to raise the bonds, to make the investments in much needed infrastructure is a hugely useful thing to do and a very effective use of capital. So I would call on governments and ministries of finance in particular, just to consider the DRR impact of this and what potentially it could do. The third sector, of course, is the international insurance and reinsurance market. This is huge. This provides the real balance sheet protection behind the local markets. They're also the creators of parametric of innovative products, but they're not. Parametric is not a panacea for all types of risk transfer. I think the second bottleneck is that, by and large, I think we are not good in the insurance industry at looking at impact inclusively. By that I mean that if we're looking at risk transfer, and particularly for difficult risks like disaster risks, we must look at it holistically. We look at every player in the arena and we work together. Now that may mean local community risk groups, peer-to-peer lending, risk retention groups, cooperatives, insurance companies, reinsurance companies, and indeed the government. Governments are also a major player in this. They're the reinsurer, effectively at a last resort, at a national level. So if you can plan together, it's a much more effective use of capital as a market. Looking at risk financing, traditionally it's been quite difficult, I think it's fair to say, to get the private sector to look at specific areas of DRR, other than for philanthropic or for general social commitment. But I think if we put our thinking caps on and get really creative, there are different things we can do. I'd like to give one example here, which I think for most of the countries in Asia with large coastlines is particularly relevant. We came across a situation where we were asked to provide protection for a group of 2,000 fishermen. And as we looked into it, we thought the opportunity was larger. We spent a year mapping the end-to-end seaweed value chain in Indonesia. Indonesia is one of the world's largest providers of carrageenan, which goes into most every form of food preservative, cosmetics, pharmaceuticals, and only 18% of the coastline is currently utilized. So we thought this was quite an interesting opportunity for coastal resilience and for coastal DRR. The net result is we've done it. We've set up a cooperative that provides that infrastructure. So we've taken the farmers, we teach them artisanally how to farm better, and we will ultimately scale that into large-scale commercial. With that, we've also put the infrastructure in terms of the IT and the systems that work with it. IoT sensors, mapping, the buyers can see exactly what's growing. The farmers get paid when they sell the seaweed, not months later. And importantly within there's a whole strand of DRR. We create seed banks. So when there's an earthquake or when there's a typhoon, we can restore and get the farmers back on their feet within maybe 6 to 8 weeks. So this is kind of a left field impact for what we can do when we start thinking outside our traditional silos. So as we move in this new phase, in this new world, into connected ecosystems, I would ask you seriously to look at some of these models for financing and also as a way of accelerating cash and impact into the whole DRR equation. It's combining in the mainstream. Thank you.
Graham, thank you very much for that. Well, we've heard from each of the panelists now on those specific questions, and we've received a great number of questions from you online and from the room itself. I am going to start again with Graham on the first question that's come in here. It's quite a short question, really. Why don't we see the capital markets and investors investing in resilience?
Sorry, could you repeat that?
Why don't we see the capital markets and investors investing in resilience?
How do we see it, or why don't we see it?
Why don't we see it?
I think we're at an extraordinary point at the moment when I think that the whole area of sustainable finance and impact finance is changing rapidly. It's relatively new, particularly for impact. And I think there are, if you looked at that broadly, there are those that are traditional, have played in the PE or the hedge fund space, the venture capital phase, that are moving into impact and sustainability. There are the family offices, the high net worth individuals for whom it is core. So I think that we're still at the early stages of that transition, but once you want to tap into that kind of finance, you have to be able to play the game in the way that they want to play it. So you need to be able to articulate what are the risks, what are we getting into, what are the returns. So it's not just, it's an important question, this, because if we're going to make long-term sustainable impact with communities, we have to move away from donor to getting communities to think about sustainable control of their own businesses and their own livelihoods. So I think within this, to answer the question, I think that we're at an early stage with it. But I think in terms of impact, you need to be able to articulate very clearly what is the objective and what are the financial returns, which in some cases not very easy to do.
Thank you, Graham. Let me turn to the three particular country representatives now. Indonesia encourages innovative and independent funding models to achieve sustainable resilience. What are other countries, what is the other countries' experiences in funding models? I'll repeat that one. Indonesia encourages innovative and independent funding models to achieve sustainable resilience. So the examples from countries experiencing in funding models. If I could begin with you, Kamal, India's perspective.
So I think the perspective from India is that some of the key social sectors, the health sector, the education sector, we really have to get resilience into non-working microphone. So I think the key thing is to learn lessons from what has happened in the past and invest in key social infrastructure sectors and get resilience into the DNA of those sectors. After the COVID-19, Government of India invested something like $4 billion in just getting its health infrastructure up to speed to cater to not just the current pandemic, but to be ready for the future as well. So I think it's really working with the sectors, getting into it. And I think there is a need, particularly in G20 nations, to really push the disaster risk reduction agenda forward. We are going to propose a special working group within G20 on disaster risk reduction next year. Let's see what is the kind of traction we get with that. There is clearly a case for that. There is also need for looking at how we leave no one behind in this disaster risk reduction work. At the COP26, we, under the Coalition for Disaster Resilient Infrastructure, we looked at infrastructure for resilient island states. So that's an expression of, not leaving anyone behind. A lot of the normative work is already beginning to happen to inform all of this, effort. Earlier during this conference, we heard from UNDRR 6 principles for resilient infrastructure. So we are making progress now in getting resilience into the DNA of large investment planning so that we build resilience for the future. We do not lock in risk. Thank you.
Bonilla, las experiencias de Honduras en los modelos financieros.
¿Me repite la pregunta?
La pregunta es las experiencias de Honduras en los modelos financieros.
Correcto. En Honduras estamos en una transición de gobierno. Venimos de un gobierno de 12 años, un tanto autocrático. Tenemos 3 meses en el gobierno de la presidenta Xiomara Castro. Sin embargo, uno de los grandes problemas es que a veces planificamos, y no solo en Honduras, a veces esto ocurre en el mundo, en Latinoamérica, planificamos para el periodo de gobierno. Si es de 4 años, se hacen planes a 4 años, y no importa si se hacen a más años, pero el gobierno que viene no le da seguimiento, y ese es un problema enorme institucional. Tenemos que cambiar esa ecuación. Tenemos que trabajar en planes a corto, largo y mediano plazo que vayan articulados a toda la estrategia mundial de la resiliencia. Y en eso estamos, justamente en eso estamos. Pero como esto es integral, y hay que ir a las causas que provocan los efectos para tener un mejor conocimiento de cómo hacerle frente y cómo particularizar, caracterizar los niveles de resiliencia que vamos a emplear en cada uno de los lugares. Una de las causas fundamentales y que tiene que ver mucho con la situación de las inundaciones es lo que pasa arriba en la montaña. Tenemos campesinos que su cultura ha sido centenaria, la agricultura migratoria. Sembrar una parcela de frijoles este año, descombra, quema, tala el bosque, lo quema y luego migra a otra parcela. Eso entonces va generando que cuando llega el momento de las lluvias, el momento de las precipitaciones, la capa de cobertura vegetal del sotobosque no existe ya en el suelo, por lo tanto la erosión va a llevar cantidades enormes, la escorrentía va a llegar cantidades enormes de sedimento a los ríos. Estos, por supuesto, se van a desbordar con menor cantidad de agua. Por lo tanto, las obras de mitigación que se desarrollen, que se realicen, ya van a ser más caras. Es una tarea enorme la que tenemos, pero repito, tenemos que articular los planes nacionales junto a los planes locales, los planes municipales, articularlos a los planes mundiales, especialmente a lo que hoy estamos tratando en este foro. Muchas gracias.
Gracias. Dr. Pollan, the experiences of Zambia.
Sorry, could you repeat the question, please?
It is, and it comes from Indonesia because they encourage innovative and independent funding models to achieve sustainable resilience. So the question is about what are other countries' experiences in funding models?
Thank you very much. So as I indicated earlier, we have obviously in Zambia domesticated the Sendai framework. So the way in which that has played out in practice has been to remodel the national budget and allocate funds right at the community level around disaster management. But as Her Honor, the Vice President of Zambia, indicated later, what remains to be seen is the extent to which those funds that have been made available for disaster management will move towards disaster risk reduction. So within that sort of context, I would also argue that a shift in the paradigm away from ring fencing and earmarking resources and then moving more towards ensuring that there's greater investment in disaster risk reduction really requires a multi-sectoral whole nation approach. But at the same time, I think there's also a lack of sort of international standard for how that plays out. If international capital finds its way into a particular region, to what extent does that take into account the country level type dynamics around disaster risk reduction, and whether there's disclosure in terms of how much has been put aside to manage the disaster risks. So the experience of Zambia, as I indicated earlier, has been first to localize resources, to make them available at the local level, and then now we're moving towards ensuring that we're moving more resources on the other side, the pre-disaster stage, as opposed to the post-disaster stage. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Pollen. We're rapidly coming to an end of this session, but I am going to ask each of you for a response to one question in particular. And it's a 1-minute response, please, I'd like from each of you. The question is about sharing best practices in mobilizing resources from non-government budget sources. So a 1-minute answer, please, of best practices in mobilizing resources from non-government budget sources. If I could start with Kamal, and the timer is on. Thank you.
I think the key to that is to inform this with good risk analytics so that we can make a business case for resilience. Say that if you make investments resilient, they are informed by risk considerations, not just present risk, but also future risk. We can make it attractive for private finance to come into play. Thank you.
Thank you, Kamal. Señor Bonilla, 1 minuto, por favor.
Muchas gracias. Ahora mismo nosotros estamos trabajando justo con el Banco Mundial en la firma del segundo KDDO, que es un seguro también en contra de desastres. Y lo importante acá es transparentar el uso de estos recursos, transparentar, buscar controles tanto de la sociedad civil como veedores, como de los entes contralores del gobierno, para que el uso de estos recursos vaya dirigido para donde se ha planificado. Obviamente nosotros estamos trabajando en Honduras, hay un programa institucionalizado en el gobierno de la presidenta Xiomara Castro en función de que los fondos, tanto públicos, tanto estatales como no estatales, fondos de la cooperación, vayan a ser utilizados de la manera correcta y sobre todo de la forma más transparente posible. Muchas gracias.
Gracias. Dr. Pollen?
3 key points from my end, and the first of all is to first understand the risk profile of the host country, and then raise awareness for the private sector and understanding of the DRR framework, and then move towards shared acceptance of the risks, and then end that with embedding some kind of risk understanding of disaster risk in investment planning over the entire horizon for return on investment. Thank you.
Thank you. Ambassador Driesmans?
One example I'd mention here is the European Fund for Sustainable Development, which is basically a blending and guarantee instrument to take in private investment. It's been very successfully applied in our partnership with Africa, and indeed so successful that we've established a successor, the EFSD Plus, to basically apply around the world.
Graham, your brief thoughts?
Do I have the last word?
You do.
Oh, wonderful, thank you. Thank you. This is a key point. key point. It's fundamental for everything we've discussed today. Everybody in this room, our children and our grandchildren, we have the two great priorities facing us, which are food security and climate. Sharing and sharing economy and sharing experiences is the only way that's going to work. So I am very helpful in this because we're moving, as we move and put our silo thinking on the bus, there it goes, it's off. Silos on the bus, it's gone. We're now thinking holistically going forward. So as the silo thinking goes, it means we need to collaborate and collaborate in a much more strong way. So I think the ability to share information, take your models, offer them, let other people explain and scale. Every time we present to a multilateral agency, the final question is your model scalable? It is. Not necessarily by us, but that's about sharing. Thank you.
Thank you, Graham. And if I may thank all my panelists for today for sharing their perspective. It's been food for thought, obviously, for us all. So thank you very much indeed. I'd just like to offer some closing thoughts, some bullet points maybe that we'll take away from this particular session. We obviously have a consensus that every decision we make, either in the public sector or in the private sector, has consequences. They'll either reduce risk or increase risk. So that's what we need to do, mainstream disaster risk reduction into investment decisions. Saying it, of course, is simple, doing it perhaps not so easy. We have to recognize that pathways to accelerate financing for prevention, disaster risk reduction, and climate change adaptation requires a think resilience approach to all investments. Debt instruments should provide and ensure incentives for building resilience. And finally, for now, all investment decisions commit to net resilience gain by A, reducing or removing actions that erode, reduce, or undermine systemic resilience, and B, by prioritizing actions that create systems intrinsically resilient to potential disruptions. I'd like to thank you all for joining us today. I leave you with a thought from Benjamin Franklin, the founding father of America. An investment in knowledge pays the best interest. If you would please vacate the room, as the space will now be prepared for the next session and cleaned according to COVID-19 rules and regulations. If you would also please check the GP 2022 agenda to make sure you're on time for your next session. Additionally, if you would please answer the GP 2022 participant survey at the end of the conference, because your contribution is essential to help us improve future global platforms. On behalf of us all on the panel, thank you very much.